The Bells of Asylum. The asylum stood at the edge of the moors, its silhouette jagged against the pale moonlit sky. Once a grand Victorian estate, it had long since decayed into a labyrinth of cracked walls, rusted gates, and windows that stared out like hollow eyes. The locals called it Blackthorn Asylum, though its official name had been lost to time. It was a place where the forgotten were sent, where the cries of the troubled were swallowed by the endless corridors and the oppressive silence of the surrounding wilderness. 3 teenagers had been admitted within weeks of each other. Their names were irrelevant to the staff, who referred to them only by their room numbers, 7, 12, and 23. Each had been deemed a danger to themselves or others, their files thick with diagnoses and warnings. They were kept in the East Wing, a section of the asylum that had been hastily repaired after a fire decades ago. The walls there were stained with soot, and the air carried the faint, acrid tang of smoke, though no flame had touched the building in years. Room 7 was a boy with hollow cheeks and eyes that never seemed to focus. He spent his days tracing patterns on the floor with his fingers, patterns that no one could decipher. Room 12 was a girl who rarely slept, her face perpetually pale, her movements unnervingly slow, as if she were moving through water. Room 23 was another boy, tall and gaunt, who would often stand perfectly still for hours, his head tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. The East Wing was eerily quiet, even for an asylum. The staff avoided it when they could, their footsteps quickening as they passed its entrance. The teenagers were left largely to themselves, their meals delivered through a slot in the door, their therapy sessions conducted in a small, dimly lit room that smelled of mildew and antiseptic. The only sound that ever seemed to come from the East Wing was the faint creak of floorboards, though no one ever walked there. One night, the power failed. The asylum was plunged into darkness, the hum of the fluorescent lights replaced by an oppressive silence. The staff scrambled to restore the electricity, but the East Wing was the last priority. In room 7, the boy stopped tracing his patterns and sat up, his head cocked to one side. In room 12, the girl rose from her cot and pressed her ear to the door, her breath shallow. In room 23, the tall boy began to sway, his movements slow and rhythmic, like a pendulum. The darkness seemed alive, pressing in from all sides. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of smoke grew stronger, though there was no fire. Somewhere in the depths of the East Wing, a door creaked open, then another, and another. The sound echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each repetition, until it seemed as if the entire wing was alive with the sound of opening doors. The boy in room 7 began to rock back and forth, his hands clutching his knees. The girl in room 12 backed away from the door, her eyes wide and unblinking. The boy in room 23 stopped swaying and turned his head sharply, as if he had heard something, something that made his lips curl into a faint, unnatural smile. The doors stopped creaking. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from somewhere deep within the East Wing came a low, guttural sound, like the growl of an animal. It was followed by a series of soft, wet footsteps, as if something were dragging itself across the floor. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the faint rustle of something brushing against the walls. The teenagers did not move. They did not cry out. They simply waited, their breaths shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The footsteps stopped outside their doors, one by one. There was a pause, a moment of unbearable tension, and then the sound of something scratching at the wood, slow and deliberate, as if testing its strength. The lights flickered back on, sudden and blinding. The scratching stopped. The hallway was empty, the doors closed. But the air still smelled of smoke, and the floorboards creaked faintly, as if something heavy had just passed over them. The teenagers remained motionless, their eyes fixed on their doors, their faces pale and drawn. And in the morning, when the staff came to deliver their meals, they found the doors to rooms 7, 12, and 23 slightly ajar, though the locks had not been tampered with. Inside, the teenagers were exactly where they should have been, their expressions blank, their eyes distant. But on the floor of each room, etched into the wood, was a single word, carved in jagged, uneven letters. Soon, the days that followed the power failure were marked by an unshakable tension. The staff moved through their routines with a newfound wariness, their eyes darting toward the east wing as if expecting something to emerge from its shadowed depths. The teenagers, however, showed no outward signs of distress. They ate their meals in silence, attended their therapy sessions without protest, and returned to their rooms as if nothing had happened. But the word carved into the floor of each room lingered in the minds of those who had seen it, a silent omen that no one dared to acknowledge. The asylum's administrator, a stern woman with a face like weathered stone, ordered an investigation into the incident. Maintenance workers checked the wiring, the locks, and the doors, but found nothing amiss. The word on the floor was dismissed as vandalism, though no one could explain how it had been done. The staff whispered among themselves, their voices low and uneasy, but no one spoke of it to the teenagers. It was easier to pretend it had never happened. But the East Wing was changing. The air grew heavier, the smell of smoke more persistent. The faint creak of floorboards became a constant presence, even during the day. The teenagers began to exhibit strange behaviors. The boy in room 7 stopped tracing patterns and instead began to draw crude, jagged symbols on the walls with his fingernails. The girl in room 12 no longer moved slowly. She would suddenly jerk her head toward the door, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if she had heard something. The boy in room 23 began to smile more often, his lips stretching into a grin that never reached his eyes. One night, a nurse making her rounds paused outside room 7. She had heard a sound, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a fist against wood. She hesitated, then opened the door. The boy was sitting on the floor, his back to her, his hand striking the wall in a steady, mechanical motion. The nurse called his name, but he did not respond. She stepped closer, her footsteps muffled by the thin carpet, and saw what he was doing. The wall was covered in symbols, carved deep into the plaster. They formed a pattern, a spiral that seemed to twist and writhe as she looked at it. The boy's hand was bleeding, his fingers raw and torn, but he did not stop. The nurse backed away, her breath catching in her throat. She closed the door and hurried down the hallway, her heart pounding. As she passed room 12, she heard a sound from within, a soft, wet rustling, like fabric being dragged across the floor. She told herself to keep walking, to report what she had seen, but something compelled her to stop. She peered through the small window in the door and saw the girl standing in the center of the room, her back to the door. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The floor around her was wet, though there was no sign of a spill. The nurse's hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob, but before she could turn it, the girl's head snapped around, her eyes locking onto the nurse's with an intensity that made her stumble back. The nurse fled, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. She did not stop until she reached the staff room, where she found 2 orderlies sitting at a table, their faces pale and drawn. They had just returned from room 23, where they had found the tall boy standing in the corner, his face pressed against the wall. He had been muttering something, they said, a string of words that made no sense, but filled them with a deep, unshakable dread. They had tried to move him, but he had resisted, his body rigid and unyielding. When they finally pulled him away, they saw that the wall where his face had been was damp, as if it had been sweating. The staff gathered in the staff room, their voices hushed and urgent. They debated what to do, but no one wanted to return to the East Wing. The administrator insisted that the teenagers were simply acting out, that their behaviors were a result of their conditions. But the nurse who had seen the boy carving symbols into the wall knew better. She had seen the spiral, and she had felt its pull, a subtle, insidious force that seemed to seep into her mind and twist her thoughts. That night, the East Wing was quiet. Too quiet. The staff on duty kept their distance, their eyes fixed on the hallway as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. But nothing did. The hours passed slowly, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards. Then, just before dawn, the lights flickered. The staff froze, their breaths held as the flickering grew more intense, the bulbs buzzing and sputtering. And then, with a final, deafening pop, the lights went out. In the darkness, the East Wing came alive. The sound of doors creaking open echoed through the hallway, followed by the soft, wet footsteps that had been heard before. But this time, there was something else. A low, guttural chanting, a language that no one recognized but filled them with a primal fear. The staff huddled together, their flashlights casting shaky beams of light that seemed to only deepen the shadows. They heard the sound of something moving, something large and heavy, dragging itself through the hallway. It stopped outside room 7, then room 12, then room 23. Each time there was a pause, a moment of unbearable tension, and then the sound of scratching, slow and deliberate. When the lights came back on, the hallway was empty. The doors to the teenagers' rooms were closed, the locks intact. But the staff knew better than to check inside. They could feel it, a presence that lingered in the air, a weight that pressed down on their chests and made it hard to breathe. And as they stood there, their flashlights trembling in their hands, they heard it, a faint, distant sound like the tolling of a bell. It came from deep within the East Wing, from a place that no one had ventured in years. The sound grew louder, echoing through the hallway, and with it came a cold, biting wind that seemed to come from nowhere. The staff fled, their footsteps echoing as they ran from the East Wing, from the asylum, from the thing that had awakened in the darkness. They did not stop until they were outside, the cold night air biting at their skin. They turned back to look at the asylum, its windows dark and lifeless, and saw something that made their blood run cold. In the window of room 23, a figure stood watching them. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by shadows. But its eyes glowed with a faint, sickly light, and its lips were curled into a smile that was anything but human. The staff did not return to the East Wing. They locked the doors leading to it and posted guards at the entrance, though no one volunteered for the duty. The asylum continued to function, but the East Wing became a forbidden place, its name spoken only in hushed tones. The teenagers in rooms 7, 12, and 23 were forgotten, their meals no longer delivered, their therapy sessions canceled. The staff told themselves that the teenagers were beyond help, that they were better off left alone. But deep down, they knew the truth. They were afraid of what they had seen, of what they had heard, of what they could not explain. The days passed, and the asylum grew quieter. The other patients seemed to sense the change, their behaviors becoming more erratic, their eyes darting toward the East Wing as if they, too, could feel its pull. The staff did their best to maintain order, but the tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that hung over the asylum like a storm cloud. Then, one night, the bell began to toll. It started softly, a distant, mournful sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The staff on duty froze, their hearts pounding as they listened. The sound grew louder, more insistent. each toll reverberating through the asylum like a physical blow. The patients began to scream, their voices rising in a cacophony of fear and despair. The staff tried to calm them, but it was no use. The bell was everywhere, its sound filling the air, the walls, the very bones of those who heard it. In the East Wing, the doors to rooms 7, 12, and 23 swung open. The boy in room 7 stepped into the hallway, his movements jerky and unnatural. His hands were still bleeding, the symbols he had carved into the walls glowing faintly in the darkness. The girl in room 12 followed, her head tilted at that same unnatural angle, her eyes blank and unseeing. The boy in room 23 was last, his grin wider than ever, his eyes glowing with that same sickly light. They moved down the hallway, their footsteps in perfect unison. The floorboards creaked beneath their weight, the sound drowned out by the tolling of the bell. The air grew colder, the smell of smoke stronger, until it seemed as if the very walls were burning. The teenagers reached the end of the hallway, where a door stood ajar. It was a door that had been locked for decades, its key long since lost. But now it swung open easily, revealing a staircase that led down into the earth. The teenagers descended, their movements slow and deliberate. The air grew thicker, the smell of smoke giving way to something else, something wet and rotting like decay. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the walls closing in around them, the darkness pressing in from all sides. And then, at last, they reached the bottom. The room was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were covered in the same symbols the boy in room 7 had carved, their lines twisting and writhing like living things. In the center of the room stood a massive bell, its surface blackened and pitted, as if it had been forged in fire. The air around it shimmered, distorted, as if the bell existed in a space between worlds. The teenagers approached the bell, their movements synchronized, their faces expressionless. The boy in room 7 reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against the surface of the bell. The sound that followed was deafening, a single, resonant note that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The walls of the room began to crack, the symbols glowing brighter, their lines twisting and writhing like snakes. The air grew colder, the smell of decay stronger, until it seemed as if the room itself were alive. And then, from the shadows, something emerged. It was tall and gaunt, its form shifting and changing, as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Its eyes glowed with that same sickly light, its mouth stretched into a grin that was too wide, too sharp, too wrong. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and clawed, and touched the bell. The sound that followed was unlike anything that had ever been heard before. It was a sound that defied description, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the soul. It filled the room, the asylum, the world, a single, resonant note that echoed through the earth and the heavens. And then, silence. The teenagers were gone. The bell was gone. The room was empty, its walls cracked and crumbling, the symbols faded and lifeless. The air was still, the smell of smoke and decay replaced by the faint, acrid tang of ash. The staff found the East Wing empty, the doors to rooms 7, 12, and 23 standing open. The walls were covered in symbols, their lines jagged and uneven, their meaning unknown. The floor was wet, though there was no sign of water, and in the center of each room, etched into the wood, was a single word, carved in jagged, uneven letters: gone. The asylum was closed soon after, its patients transferred to other facilities. The building was left to decay, its walls crumbling, its windows shattered. But the locals still avoided it, their eyes darting toward it as they passed, their footsteps quickening as if they feared it might wake. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind was still and the moon was full, they could hear it, a faint, distant sound, like the tolling of a bell. It came from deep within the earth, from a place that no one dared to venture. And those who heard it knew, deep in their hearts, that the thing that had awakened in the darkness was still there, waiting, watching, biding its time. For the bell had tolled, and the door had been opened. And somewhere in the shadows between worlds, the thing that had been summoned was waiting for its time to come again.